Well, hello. This is Father Nick, the priest and pastor of the Fort Church of St. Martin's Parish in Doswell, Virginia, and I have again with me the Reverend Dr. Ross Wright. Ross, how are you?
I'm doing great. I'm glad to be here tonight.
Very good. Well, thank you. Thank you for being with me. We're going to continue our conversation about how do we get the New Testament, and we're now on. This is the sixth part. We're going to move into discussing the Gospels now, and we're going to start with the Gospel that scholars believe was the first Gospel to have been written, and that is the Gospel according to Mark. And so this whole segment will be discussing the Gospel according to Mark. So I said that scholars believe that Mark was written first of the four Gospels that are in our New Testament, and really of any narrative gospel. So even the Gospels that got written much later that are not included in our New Testament, Mark predates all of these. And so the question that might come up first is, when was Mark written? And Ross, I wonder, I've got a few dates that I've heard different scholars mention, but what would be if somebody asked you, Dr. Wright, when was Mark written? What would you say?
Yeah, the short answer I would give, Nick, is that it was written in the shadow of the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem, 70 AD, when the Romans destroyed the temple. Some scholars believe that Mark was written just before the temple was destroyed, because he doesn't actually mention the destruction of the temple. Some think that it was written after the destruction of the temple. So I think saying that in the shadow of the destruction of Jerusalem temple kind of captures it. So right at the period where the Romans took a concerted effort to put down the Jewish rebellion. That's the period that makes most sense to me.
Yeah, I'd say that's probably the large consensus, the majority consensus in New Testament scholarship, is that somewhere during the time of the first Jewish revolt against Rome, which was from around 66 AD to 74 AD. Sometime in that period seems to be about where most New Testament scholars want to locate the writing of the Gospel of Mark. Now, we should say that we don't have any, scholars don't have any of the autographs, the very original texts of any of the books of the New Testament or the Old Testament, for that matter, any of the books of the Bible. We only have later copies. Now, in some cases, fairly, with the New Testament especially, fairly close to the time of the autographs, at least relative to other ancient texts, but still we don't have the originals, and so we don't have a way of actually knowing when exactly any of these texts were written, and we don't have any contemporary of the writing of these texts saying, well, a guy named Mark wrote down a book about Jesus in 70 AD, or during the revolt, the first Jewish revolt against Rome. We don't have anything like that. So this is a work of, we might say, historical speculation. I'd say that scholars are on very good footing in saying that the Gospels were all written, all four of them, in the first century, because we do have texts in the early second century that cite these gospel texts, these four Gospels: Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. So we know that they had to have been written in the first century. And we know that they had to have been written after the death and resurrection of Christ, which places them after the 30s of the first century. But then it's really difficult to nail down exactly when they might have been written. And to give a sense of this, we have some folks saying that Mark was written as late as, say, 74 or 75 AD or CE. That is, after the first Jewish revolt against Rome had come to an end. That war had come to an end. And we'll talk more maybe about that war because it flavors the text in a sense. So some folks who want to place it as late as that, as late as say 75 CE or AD. But then there are some New Testament scholars like the late Bishop of Woolwich, John A.T. Robinson, who was, of controversial fame from the 1960s for his book Honest to God. He did most of his work in New Testament, and he wrote several books arguing for a date of 45 CE or AD for the Gospel according to Mark. So a good 20 years before the beginning of the first Jewish revolt against Rome. He was willing to argue and made an argument for a date that early. Now, nobody seems to have picked up on that. Nobody in scholarship, as far as I know, thinks that it was that early, but he made an argument for it, and it's no less a cogent argument than the arguments that place it at the time of the first Jewish revolt against Rome. Any other thoughts about dating before we move on to who might have written this gospel?
One of the reasons why scholars associate the Gospel of Mark with the Jewish revolt that Nick mentioned and the destruction of the temple is there's a long chapter, which we'll look at in a few minutes, chapter 13, sometimes referred to as the Little Apocalypse, which has this really lengthy description of destruction of the temple. It describes intense suffering on the part of believers. It talks about the desolating sacrifice. It's a series of phrases that seem to line up pretty closely with what we know from other historical sources about what was going on in Jerusalem in the period leading up to the destruction of the temple and the end of the Jewish rebellion. So that's some of the evidence that scholars use to situate Mark's gospel in that nexus of events around the Jewish revolt and the putting down of the revolt by the Romans.
Yeah, that's good. That's good. And just to give a sense of how the same evidence within the text can be used in different arguments for dating. John A.T. Robinson, Bishop Robinson, had argued for his earlier date of 45 because he argued that the desolating sacrilege in the temple mentioned in Mark chapter 13 was a reference to the Emperor Caligula's desire to put a statue of himself in the temple. And that was supposed to happen in the early 40s of the first century and was going to happen until Caligula's untimely demise. So for him, he looks at that Mark 13, that little apocalypse, and but Bishop Robinson, that is, read it and said, well, this must be referring to Caligula putting his statue in the temple or just wanting to do that. And so, I mean, the same texts that are used to place it later can also be used to place it earlier. And that's just part of that historical guesswork that scholars have to do. It's educated guesswork, but it's still guesswork.
Yeah, I didn't realize that was how that was the basis of his claim for an earlier date.
Yeah. So similarly, we don't really know who wrote the gospel according to Mark. I know that in your Bible, it says at the top of the page, the gospel according to Mark. And so you say, well, we know it must be Mark, except that designation of this gospel being the gospel according to Mark isn't in the earliest manuscripts. That this is not. We don't have this until later. It's in the 2nd century that Mark's name gets attached to this text, and that's because of a leader in the church named Papias, who writes about what he has heard about how the Gospels got written. And he is the one who says that there was a group of traditions, pronouncement stories. We've mentioned these before, Crei, that these pronouncement stories were told by Peter, that's Simon Peter, that Jesus's kind of first disciple, you might say, his right-hand man, and that his secretary, you might say, Mark, wrote these Crei, these pronouncement stories down, and that's how we get the gospel according to Mark. That's what Papias tells us, but a lot of contemporary scholars question whether or not that's right, question whether or not Papias is actually describing the writing of the Gospel of Mark or something else, because he doesn't talk anything about a narrative, a story being told there. If Papias is right, and that the Gospel according to Mark represents the Petrine tradition, that is a tradition of St. Peter, and was written down by Mark, it still doesn't actually tell us who this Mark was. And so yet later tradition would try and identify who this Mark was. Some identified this Mark with the John Mark mentioned in Acts chapter 12. And I was thinking about reading that, but I don't think we need to do that. If you want to, though, you can go and take a look at Acts chapter 12, and you'll see there both Peter and Paul have interactions with a young man named John Mark. There's also a Mark mentioned in 1 Peter, which we talked about last time. So this is in 1 Peter 5. And actually, did you want to read this for us, Ross?
Sure. Yeah, I just need to grab my Bible. Sorry.
So this is in 1 Peter chapter 5, and it's verses 12 and 13. It's right at the end of the letter, and it's kind of the signing off of the letter. But we get here in chapter 5, verses 12 and 13, a mention of a Mark.
Okay. Final greetings and benediction. Peter writes, through Silvanus, whom I consider a faithful brother, I have written this short letter to encourage you and to testify that this is the true grace of God. Stand fast in it. Your sister church in Babylon, chosen together with you, sends you greetings, and so does my son Mark. Greet one another with a kiss of love. Peace to all of you who are in Christ.
So who is this Mark? We don't know. Is this a literal son of Peter? Is this a figurative son that is a son by way of, say, baptism, someone that Peter himself baptized? We really don't know. And is this the author of the gospel that we call the gospel according to Mark? We really have no way of knowing. The current kind of hermeneutic of suspicion that predominates New Testament studies is not convinced that we have any idea who wrote this gospel, because the gospel itself doesn't tell us who wrote it. And so current scholarship tends to just say, well, it was written by some anonymous author, and since we don't know his name, we'll refer to him as Mark because that's what the tradition says, but we don't know who it was. Ross, any thoughts on that?
Yeah, It's an interesting contrast, isn't it, to Paul's epistles, where Paul is so upfront about his authorship. I mean, he began the first letter of his epistles. They begin Paul, and so it's very clear that his apostolic calling and his personality just radiate from the Pauline epistles. Where, as in with Mark's gospel, there's a certain anonymity. It's as if the writer is trying to place the emphasis not on the gospel according to Mark, but it's the gospel of Jesus Christ. And the writer, the author, just allows himself to be somewhat invisible to keep the person of Jesus Christ. So just an interesting difference or contrast between this form of New Testament literature and some other parts of the New Testament that we've studied recently. And just one other additional comment. We talked about how sometimes a writer would use a pseudonym. People have said that Mark might very well have been the author of Mark simply because it will be an odd pseudonym to choose. It's such a common name. There are only, I guess, 2 Marks mentioned in the New Testament, but Mark was one of the most common names in Palestine, the Roman Empire at that time. So it would be a sort of an odd choice for pseudonym. So that's why some people think it may very well have been someone named Mark, but we don't know.
Yeah, and so there's one set of scholarship that's very suspicious of the claims of tradition, and then there's yet other scholars who think that maybe we can rely more on tradition than we have, and we should put a little more trust in that tradition and see if it works out. And so one of the books that if you want to take the tradition seriously, this Jesus and the Eyewitnesses, the Gospels as Eyewitness Testimony by Richard Bauckham is a good place to go. There are other places to go if you want something a little more suspicious, a little more, motivated by that hermeneutic of suspicion. Maybe one of the most kind of skeptical readings would be A Myth of Innocence, Mark and Christian Origins by Burton Mack. So these 2 books are kind of at the extreme ends of the spectrum. Mack is not sure that there was actually a person named Jesus that this is all about anyway. That might be just a creation or some figure from the very beginnings of the movement who got picked up and stories got told about him, but he wasn't really the one who got things started. And so Mack's very suspicious and skeptical. On the other hand, Bauckham is saying, well, tradition is probably really reliable, and we should stick with that. So, and then most scholars fall somewhere in between those two. Most scholars, I think, wouldn't tend toward either extreme, but somewhere more in the middle. But this does raise the question: where might the Gospel according to Mark have been written? And part of how you answer that is going to depend on whether or not you think this is written by one of these Marks that we've discussed or someone else. So for example, if you think that it was written by Peter's secretary in that sense, then you might think that it's going to come out of Rome. And so a lot of traditions will place the writing of the Gospel of Mark in Rome, because that's where, of course, Peter ended up, according to tradition. That's where he was martyred, and martyred in the early to mid 60s of the first century. So a lot of traditions will say that someone like John Mark or the Mark mentioned in First Peter was with Peter in Rome, and that after his martyrdom or sometime right before his martyrdom, this Mark wrote down the stories that Peter told about his time with Jesus. There's also a tradition that links Mark, that Saint Mark the Evangelist, with Alexandria in Egypt, the place of the great library of Alexandria, but also of the great catechetical school, early Christian catechetical school, kind of the center of Christian learning for the first few centuries of the church. And this is why the Coptic Church, the Coptic Orthodox Church, looks to Saint Mark in the way that the Roman Catholic Church looks to Saint Peter as their kind of patron saint. The Coptic Orthodox Church looks to Saint Mark because of his association with Alexandria. So those are two options that have been put out there. But I think the majority of contemporary scholars who think that Mark, the Gospel according to Mark, was written by someone anonymous, or perhaps somebody by the name of Mark, but not one of these people connected to Peter and mentioned in the New Testament, would place the writing of Mark in Syria, so just north of the Galilee, just north of Israel. That would be the location, and again, sometime within or just after the first Jewish revolt against Rome. Is that what you've read also, Ross?
Yeah, Syria. That makes a lot of sense to me. For example, some of the geographical references in Mark 13 about fleeing from the hills, or into, there are a number of different topographical and geographical references seem to line up with Syria.
So this is, I think, one of the interesting things is that if you have if you put more reliance on these old church traditions of Petrine influence and Mark being connected with Peter, then you're going to end up with a writing somewhat later and in Rome or Alexandria, so much further away from where the events actually happen. It's actually the more skeptical New Testament scholars who question the tradition and look at the text and say, what can we find out about the writing of this text from within it, who would place it closer to where the events actually happened, and also allow for the possibility of it being written earlier than the 70s or maybe even the 60s. But I think that's probably enough talking about the when and the where and the by whom. But I think all of this talking here about this has raised this kind of specter of the first Jewish revolt against Rome, and the influence of this really traumatic event in the land of Israel there in the first century. We've already mentioned that this will end with the destruction of the temple, which was the central place of worship for the Jewish people. And unlike the pagans who had, their gods might have a temple in this city, and the same God can have another temple in another city, and there'll be shrines all in between. For Israel, there was one temple in Jerusalem. That's the one temple of the one God. And yet by the end of this war, it was destroyed. The land was ravaged. It was really a traumatic event, and seems to have left its fingerprints on this text. And Ross, did you want to say something about that and where we might see some of those fingerprints?
Yes, again, to refer to Mark 13, as I mentioned before, this long, detailed description of intense suffering, it seems to line up with as I've said before, things we know about the Jewish revolt. It's important to remember that the early believers, as we mentioned, were Jews, and so they would have come under the same kind of censure as Jews who didn't believe didn't follow Jesus. So they were a target of this Roman anti-Jewish campaign. So yeah, I don't think I have a whole lot more insight into that. I think you've summarized it nicely. I guess one other thing is just it's a reminder that all these gospels were written to a community of individual people rather than just statements in general about Jesus. John was writing to a community, we think it may be the Gospel of John, that is, of Jews who had been rejected from the synagogue. And so there are a lot of references in the Gospel of John when we look at the Johannine literature, seem to line up with that experience. Luke was written to a different community. And so each gospel writer has a particular group of people in mind, a perceived audience. And the gospel writer, the evangelist, will select the relevant parts of the story and teachings of Jesus that are important for their community. So it's not like they're changing the story or making things up, but they're adapting and focusing the aspects of the tradition in a particular community that they were concerned about and to whom they were writing.
Yeah, so one of the things that you've mentioned a couple of times is this 13th chapter of the gospel, according to Mark. And just to kind of lay it out, Mark has just over, it goes into a 16th chapter, but it actually ends very early in that 16th chapter. So it's really about 15 chapters long. And one of these kind of, you might call it the penultimate chapters just before the passion and death of Christ is this 13th chapter that, as you say, is called the Little Apocalypse. And I get the sense that's provides a hermeneutic, a key for understanding the rest of the text. Would you say that?
Can I go ahead and just jump in here and talk a little bit about the apocalyptic
great.
element?
Mm-hmm.
I want to talk just for a few minutes about a key feature of Mark's gospel that really distinguishes it from Luke and John and Matthew, and that is the apocalyptic element. And I'll say what I mean by that, and then I'll show some examples in Mark that help us understand this framework. The word apocalyptic, as we've said in previous sessions, means unveiling or to remove the veil. And I like to think of it like what happens when you go to the theater or to the opera, or when we used to, when it was still possible. There's that moment before the show begins or the opera begins where everybody's sitting in the audience, and then the house lights go down and the curtain opens, and suddenly you're transported into another world. Apocalyptic is a kind of literature in the New Testament and the Old Testament that lifts the veil and allows us to catch a glimpse into God's reality, God's new world. A couple of New Testament books that we particularly associate with apocalyptic are the Revelation of John the Seer, the book of Revelation. And we looked also in a couple weeks ago when we were looking at Paul's letters at 1 Thessalonians chapter 4, which is this very detailed description that Paul gives of the coming of the Lord at the end of human history. There's also a very important tradition of apocalyptic in the Old Testament and in Judaism as a whole, Jewish apocalyptic. And the New Testament writers, particularly Mark, are heavily influenced by Jewish apocalyptic, though they make some significant changes in their emphases based on their conviction about Jesus. I want to mention two fundamental characteristics of biblical apocalyptic as a kind of framework for the rest of what I'll say. One emphasis is an emphasis on the end of the world as we know it and the coming of God's new world. So the end of human history, the coming of the Messianic kingdom. And then the second emphasis is an emphasis on the cosmic battle between the forces of evil, which have us wrapped up and helpless, really, and the forces of God's liberating messianic power. Let me say something about each of those briefly, and then I'll illustrate through Mark's couple of texts in Mark. In Old Testament apocalyptic, the hope for the coming of a new world is often associated with the coming of the Messiah. And the most, probably the best known and easiest to understand text that links the coming of God's new age with the Messiah is Daniel chapter 7. And I've asked Nick to read that for us. It's this image of the Son of Man. And chapter 7, if you want to follow along, Daniel's in the Old Testament. It's one of the big prophetic books. It goes Ezekiel, Daniel, or if you want to just listen, that's fine.
So that's Daniel 7, verses 13
and 14, or is it 14 and 15? Hold on a second. It's Daniel chapter 7, verses 13 and 14.
Okay. I saw in the night visions, and behold, with the clouds of heaven there came one like a son of man, and he came to the Ancient of Days, and he was presented before him, and to him was given dominion and glory and kingdom, that all peoples, nations, and languages should serve him. His dominion is an everlasting dominion, which shall not pass away, and his kingdom one that shall not be destroyed.
So this image of the one coming like a son of man who will have dominion is part of the basis of the Old Testament Jewish hope in the coming of the Messiah and of the Messianic age. So throughout the history of Judaism, there's been this hope that when Messiah comes, the new age of God will reign. We get a glimpse of this hope in the New Testament. Remember that passage in John 11 at the death of Lazarus, where Jesus and Mary and Martha are all in the precincts of Lazarus's tomb. Lazarus is dead. Jesus says to Mary, do you believe that your brother will rise? And she says, yes, I believe that he will rise again at the resurrection of the dead. So this is a reference to her hope and the coming Messianic age. And Jesus says, I am the resurrection of life. Do you believe this? And she says, yes, Lord, I believe that you are the Christ who's come into the world. So already before the resurrection of Jesus, you get this Jewish hope in the coming of the Messiah, and it's becoming focused on Jesus himself. And just to point out also that in contemporary Judaism, there still lingers the hope, so the deep hope that the Messiah will usher in God's new kingdom. Jewish belief in the end of this world and the coming of the new age varies a lot from group to group. It's a little bit like Christianity. So you'll find a whole range of ideas and beliefs, but there's certainly alive within contemporary Judaism is this longing for the coming of the Messianic age. So Mark's gospel is from beginning to end apocalyptically oriented because it's full of references to the end of this age and the coming of God's new age. Jesus' inaugural sermon in Mark chapter 1 emphasizes that the time has come, the time has been fulfilled, the kingdom of God is at hand. So there's this emphasis on the coming of the kingdom. But it's Mark 13, the little apocalypse, where we see the apocalyptic element in Mark the most clearly. And I've asked Nick if he would read a couple of just two short passages from this really long text. I wish we had time to read the whole thing. It's just a little bit too long for this format. But towards the beginning or middle of this long speech that Jesus gives, he describes a period of intense suffering on the part of God's people, of wars and rumors of wars, of cosmic upheaval, where even the stars and the sun and the moon will sort of collapse. It's this very vivid, lurid picture of the end of human existence as we know it. Nick, would you read for us chapter 13, verses 19 and 20?
Right. For in those days there will be such tribulation as has not been from the beginning of the creation which God created until now, and never will be. And if the Lord had not shortened the days, no human being would be saved, but for the sake of the elect, whom he chose, he shortened the days.
So in addition to this theme of suffering and cosmic upheaval, there's this emphasis on urgency. The time is short. God has cut short this period of suffering, and which will come in glory. And that's the line mentioned from this little apocalypse section. It ends with a vision of the coming of the Son of Man on the clouds in heaven, and God sending his angels to gather his people, referred to as the elect. This is chapter 13, verses 24 to 27.
But in those days, after that tribulation, the sun will be darkened, and the moon will not give its light, and the stars will be falling from heaven, and the powers in the heavens will be shaken. And then they will see the Son of Man coming in clouds with great power and glory. And then he will send out the angels and gather his elect from the four winds, from the ends of the earth to the ends of heaven.
And as you hear that, just try to think of a community of believers to whom Mark was writing, who were suffering intensely because of their faith in Jesus. Perhaps they had lost their jobs. Perhaps they had been cast out of their families because of their belief in Jesus as the Messiah. This is probably before we have any official statewide persecution by the emperor. That happens a bit later. But certainly the currents of hostility towards Christianity, towards Christians, were very much alive. And so imagine a group of people who are just intensely suffering and perplexed by it all, hearing these words of Jesus that the time is short, the Son of Man is coming. They would have heard that as good news, as a word of liberation, the way that say people who were in internment camps during World War II heard of the coming of the liberating armies of the Allies. So that the time is short for them means that Christ is coming to vindicate God's righteousness and to gather his people. The last thing I want to say about this emphasis on the end of the world as we know it and the coming of God's age is that the New Testament writers, and Mark in particular, while they use Jewish apocalyptic themes, they make some significant shifts in the apocalyptic schedule based on their conviction that the resurrection of Jesus is already the beginning of the Messianic age. And I think the simplest way I can illustrate this is to show you a little diagram that I've created for students, Randolph-Macon, when I'm teaching about Paul and Paul's apocalyptic. But this will serve, I think, perfectly well for Mark as well. Luke, Nick, would you mind giving me a screen share possibility? Yeah, let's see, you've done that. Let me see if I can call this up.
I've allowed you to do it, so it should be able to work.
All right, let's see. Here we go. Okay, I've got it. Bear with me just a second while I kind of walk you through this. Nick, can you see that okay? Nick?
Not yet.
Not yet. Okay, hold on. I may need to pull this up on Wednesday. Sorry, I just I never seem to be able to get this right. Just so let me try one more thing. Hold on a second.
So while you're working on that, I'll say a little bit more about this apocalyptic and eschatological theme that runs through the gospel according to Mark. And that is that if you understand that this is the worldview that animates this gospel, then it'll help you to understand what happens in it. So part of this view is that all of creation should be under God's dominion, under God's reign. It should be God's kingdom because he is its creator. But for some reason, a reason that we Christians designate as the fall, though that language isn't here in the text of the Gospel according to Mark itself, but it does presume that the whole of creation, the whole of the world, the cosmos is the Greek word, is under the reign and dominion of what we would name as Satan, and the fallen powers and principalities. We saw this also in Paul's letters, and mentions of it even in the Catholic epistles. I believe it's Ephesians or is it Colossians that speaks, I guess it's Colossians that speaks of the world being under the sway of the prince of the power of the air, who we identify as Satan. And so the world is under the sway of the fallen powers and principalities. And this means that this is the explanation, for example, for why the Roman Empire is able to be in charge of and conquer and be over as an oppressor the people and the land of Israel, is because it is a representative on earth of a fallen power in heaven. And so Christ is among us in this gospel, he's in the world in a sense as one fighting battles against these fallen powers. And that takes the form of healing people of illness, casting out what the gospel according to Mark calls unclean spirits. It does not use the word daimon or demon. It uses the phrase unclean spirits. These are fallen spirits. Jesus casts them out. But even the fallen powers of nature, Jesus is, gains control of for the kingdom of God, to reestablish God's reign over creation. So that he controls even the wind and the sea. We hear his disciples proclaim when he stills the storm. And so we get all of these kind of indications of these ways that Christ is making God's reign or God's kingdom present in this fallen world that's under the power of, or under the reign of, the fallen powers and principalities and Satan himself. It looks like you've gotten up what you wanted to get up, so I'll turn it back over to you, Ross.
Yeah, thanks. That was a brilliant summary of my second point, actually, so that makes my work a lot easier. Yeah, the second emphasis I want to mention was the cosmic battle between the forces of evil, which we are really helpless to deal with on our own. And the coming of God's strong man in Jesus, who binds Satan and offers us deliverance. So thank you for that summary. That was really perfect anticipation of what I was going to say. Here's a little chart, which I hope will help us understand the difference between Jewish apocalyptic and how it gets changed and transformed through Paul and through Mark. At the top, this is a little diagram of how traditional Jewish apocalyptic understands the relationship between the old world, or the world in which we currently live, and the new messianic age. So here's the creation of the universe. Here's human history, which is the old age. Here's the coming of the Messiah, whom Jews believe has not come yet, and the advent of the messianic age, or the new age, stretching out into God's everlasting kingdom. And so Jews believe, traditional Jewish belief, apocalyptic belief, is that when Messiah comes, there'll be a vindication of the righteous and the wicked will be judged, and God will set right those things which are currently not right. One of the nice ways of kind of capturing contemporary Jewish vision of this is the novels of Chaim Potok, like My Name is Asher Lev, and some of the other Jewish literature about Hasidic communities. There's this really intense and really quite powerful expectation of God's redemption when Messiah comes. So that's just an example of how this gets worked out in contemporary Judaism. Here's how the New Testament shifts things a bit. So here's the creation of the universe, human history, old age. But the new age breaks in at the resurrection of Jesus. So it's already broken in, and it will break in with perfection when Christ comes back at his coming. So the fullness of the Messianic age. And notice where we live is in the overlap of the ages. So the new age is already broken in, even as the old age continues, but it's on its way out. And the orange line represents human life as we know it. So already the presence of the Holy Spirit, the Christian community, the miracles of Jesus that we read about in the New Testament are indications of the inbreaking of the new age. But we know that we still struggle with the forces of sin and all about life that's not yet fully redeemed. And so Christians believe that this will happen at the second coming. So I hope that diagram sheds a little bit of light. So Mark presents Jesus as God's strong man. Let me just kill this. Hold on. How do I end this? Jesus is God's strong man who's come to liberate us. I just want to read a sentence from a commentary that I found really helpful on the Gospel of Mark. It's by Joel Marcus, who's a New Testament scholar at Duke Divinity School. He writes, Mark wants to assert that Jesus is God's holy warrior, the Davidic Messiah who battles the demonic powers arrayed against God's people, and thus is the fulfillment of the hopes of revolutionaries and other messianic hopes. But I love that image of Jesus as God's holy warrior who comes to liberate us. So those are just a couple of thoughts on apocalyptic, this theme in Mark's gospel. And as you read Mark, if you just keep your eyes open, I think you'll see apocalyptic appears fairly often.
That's great. I really appreciate that. And I'd like to pick up with these themes in Mark, but maybe take it in a slightly different direction, because I'm actually a little more interested in talking now about the way that the narrative of Mark is structured. You see, Mark is a collection in some sense of crai, as Papias had suggested. And we have these pronouncement stories, especially in the early part of Mark, the first half of Mark, but even also in the latter half as he's teaching in the temple. So he does take these pre-existing pronouncement stories, or crai, and he weaves them together. But it's not simply as if he is beating a thread. It's not as if we just get one and then the next, like a list, as I mentioned when we talked about oral tradition. Instead, he weaves them together into an overarching narrative. And it's the first time that that's been done. We don't see that in the epistles. We get mentions of Jesus's teachings. We get mentions of Jesus's life. We get hymns about the importance of Jesus's life, but we don't actually get a narrative of Jesus's life. Now, we had talked about gospel before in those epistles, especially Paul's epistles. But Paul is not talking about a book, a gospel book like Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, because of course these don't exist. But I do think what Paul is talking about, and what the other places in the New Testament that mention gospel or good news, what they're talking about is this new and wonderful thing God has done in the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus. this breaking in of God's kingdom, this reclaiming, this justification and sanctification of the world that begins with the life, death, and resurrection of Christ, who, as Paul said, was in the form of God, but did not feel equality with God to be something to be grasped or held on to, but became human, took on human flesh. And that's why these are gospels, is because they're the narrative of this new thing God has begun in the life, death, and resurrection of Christ. They are the narrative of grace becoming flesh for us. And Mark is really tells us that that's what he's up to with the very first verse of his gospel. Mark chapter 1, verse 1, the beginning of the gospel of Jesus Christ, the Son of God. There are some manuscripts that don't have this little phrase, the Son of God, and so it's been suggested that the original began just by saying the beginning of the gospel of Jesus Christ. Who knows? But the text does focus in on this idea of Christ as the Son of God. This shows up at key points within the gospel. So whether or not it's in the first verse doesn't matter, because it's already there in the first chapter with the baptism of Jesus. We'll see it again in various ways when he's casting out unclean spirits. We'll see, but especially in the very middle of Mark's gospel with the transfiguration, and then finally at the very end at Christ's crucifixion, he'll be acclaimed Son of God in those three sections by a voice other than a demonic voice, and so one that we can trust, and that is part of the narrative structure of Mark's gospel. So a question that New Testament scholars have kind of talked about from time to time, and I wonder, Ross, if you've heard this, and maybe what Joel Marcus might have to say, or if you've read about it elsewhere, is what's the genre of literature that we can place these gospels in, and for I think a good long time, New Testament scholarship said, well, they're sui generis. They're a genre all to themselves. There's nothing like them in ancient literature. My sense is that the consensus there has changed, and that now they're being recognized as what's known as bios. Or this is the Greek word for an ancient biography. Is that what you've heard also, Ross?
Yes, and apparently there's new work that's been done on these the bios or bioi to show that they had a range of they were done in different ways. There was a fair amount of flexibility. I think this model had been rejected in earlier scholarship in part because there was a kind of a two-dimensional understanding of what the models, the Jewish models, the bios looked like. But actually, there was a fair amount of variation and creativity in them. One thing that I learned was new learning for me as I prepared for this session. I got this again from Joel Marcus's commentary. Is as he talks about genre, is this a biography? Is it a novel? Is it is it its own creation called the gospel? That Mark's it's not really a biography in the traditional sense that we think of biography, where you start with a person's birth. That's not where Mark starts. He starts with Jesus fully grown and launching into the movement. And the analogy that Marcus uses, which I think is really intriguing, is the biographies of Martin Luther King by Taylor Branch, where they begin not with the birth of Martin Luther King, but they begin with the movement. And you're plunged sort of in medias res into the middle of the movement, because their emphasis is not just on Martin Luther King as a person, but on King and the movement. And I think that's a nice way of thinking about what Mark is interested in. He's interested in Jesus as the movement of God into human existence, and not just the biographical details. Plenty of biographical tales, but not the way that we would tell biography in a modern sense.
Yeah, that's right. And it seems to me that one of the scholars who really kind of made the argument that has since been picked up that these really are bioi or each one is a bios, a biography in the ancient sense, was a Church of England priest and New Testament scholar named Richard Burridge. He's done, I think, a lot of the arguing that others have picked up on it. But it is important, as you say, Ross, to not confuse ancient biography with modern biography. There's just not the kinds of interest in personal details, as you say, in the Gospels that there are in modern biographies. There's also not an interest in subjectivity. The Gospel writers aren't interested in mapping out a psychological profile of Jesus, getting into his head. And that's the way a lot of modern biographies try and do. What was he really thinking? What were his motivations? What were his passions? That's not what's going on in these Gospels. But Mark takes this form, this genre of bios, and makes use of it to present the gospel, this what God is doing in this life, death, and resurrection. And so that's what he tells us at the very beginning. This is the beginning of the gospel, or the good news, the euangelion of Jesus Christ, the Son of God. And then he jumps right into it. And he uses, well, before I get into that, let me just say that as he is making the move from oral tradition to written text, it marks his gospel off as slightly different than Matthew and Luke and even John, that use literary precedent. We'll talk about this next time, that Matthew and Luke actually use Mark's narrative structure. They just borrow it, and then that's how they build their gospel. But that's a very literary move to look at another text. Mark, on the other hand, is making the move from oral tradition to written text. And that's what I think just reveals the brilliance of Mark's gospel, because it was thought of by many, and even some New Testament scholars will still treat it this way, as kind of a poorly written text, because the Greek isn't this grand literary fashion that we see in other texts, like, say, the Epistle of James, or even anything like Paul, and yet it's written for an oral context, and that's why we see some of this, what we might think of as bad Greek, is actually good Greek. But it's good Greek if you're reading this out loud, if its primary way of getting to people is by being heard read. And so we see this word kai show up again and again in Mark's gospel, a word that's translated as and. So a lot of sentences begin with and. If you just open your Bible and you turn to Mark, and you'll see, almost every other sentence seems to be beginning with the word and, or the word immediately, euthos. He keeps you moving along. It works really great if you read this out loud. It's got this feeling that you're kind of moving to the next thing. You're never stuck. You're never sitting around meditating on a text. Instead, you're hearing a story be told. It's just like if someone was telling you a story out loud. They tend to use these kinds of words to keep it moving along. And yet, even with that, there's some really sophisticated techniques being put to use. One of these is called intercalation, or because that's not a word that just trips off the tongue easily, some people like to call it the Markan sandwich. And that's where he'll take a story and he'll split it open and he'll put another story right in between it. And so you have the sandwich of stories, and the stories help interpret one another or clarify the meaning of the other. And so one of them is, I'm just going to give you two examples because we're already going pretty long now. But the two examples I want to lift up are one is in Mark chapter 5, and this is the story of Jairus's daughter. Jairus is a leader of the synagogue. And I was going to have it read, but I think that's just going to take too much time. But you should recognize this, and you can go to Mark chapter 5 and read it yourself if you want. But Jairus, who's a leader of the synagogue, comes to Jesus and he says, Jesus, my daughter is really sick. She's not doing well. Can you please come and heal her? And he says, my little daughter is at the point of death. Come and lay your hands on her so that she may be made well and live. And he went with them. And so Jesus is going with Jairus to go heal Jairus's daughter. And as they're walking along, and the very next verse picks us up, as they're going along, a woman reaches out and touches the hem of his garment. And we're told that this woman, and I'm just going to go ahead and quote here from the text. This is Mark chapter 5, verse 25. And there was a woman who had a flow of blood for 12 years, and who had suffered much under many physicians, and had spent all that she had, and was no better, but rather grew worse. Now, a couple things to note here. She's had this for 12 years. And what this is, this hemorrhage or this flow of blood is, well, I don't want to be indelicate, but I think women know what this is referring to. This isn't a wound that's bleeding. This is well, like I said, women know what this is referring to. And this woman has had it for 12 years. And what this does is it makes her unclean, which just means that she can't go into the temple. She cannot go and worship in the temple, and the court reserved for women. She wouldn't be allowed in there. Proximity to the temple is denied her. But she touches Jesus, the hem of his garment. She's immediately healed. Well, then in verse 35, we're back to Jesus going with Jairus. But while they're on their way, they learn that Jairus's daughter is dead. And so Jesus then says, well, let's go ahead. Go ahead on. I still want to go see her. He says, the child is not dead, but sleeping. And they laughed at him, but he put them all outside and took the child's father and mother and those who were with him and went in where the child was. Taking her by the hand, he said to her, Talitha Kumi, which means, little girl, I say to you, arise. So here's an interesting little bit of Aramaic in the midst of Mark's Greek gospel, Talitha Kumi, which means, little girl, I say to you, arise. And this image of rising up from the dead should have that should ring bells for us, that this is an image or a foretaste of resurrection. It's not the resurrection, but it should bring to mind the resurrection. And immediately the girl got up and walked, for she was 12 years old. That's verse 42. So remember, the woman had the flow of blood for 12 years, and here we find that the little girl is 12 years old. So it's the same age as, well, anyway, it's hard to know all that Mark is trying to tell us in that, and commentators dig into that kind of thing. But one thing we can see that's clear is that there are deep connections between these two stories, and Mark has placed the one right, he split open one and put the other one right in between them so that we can make those connections, so we can see those connections. There's one other one, but Ross, did you have anything that you wanted to say about that one?
No, that's brilliant. As you're looking at the other one, I just want to point out, if this was read out loud, you say at a Eucharist or all at once or over time, which is one of the theories about Mark. It's worth pointing out that in our own lifetime, Alec McGowan made famous the reading of the Gospel of Mark. I think it took about 2 hours. It was a Broadway presentation. It's just interesting that when someone was deciding which of the Gospels to read, it was Mark, not Luke, John, or Matthew. I think for all the reasons that you're mentioning.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's. I've actually had a confirmation class. That was the end of the class, was for us to stand there and we read, and this is at Fork. We read all together, taking it kind of a chapter at a time, read through the whole of the Gospel of Mark as preparation for confirmation. Yeah. So chapter 11 is another example of, and maybe a little bit easier to understand, but an example of the Markan sandwich. So we have here, Jesus is now in Jerusalem, and so the majority of the texts take place in and around the temple. The temple is a focus until Christ's own crucifixion. But this is the Monday after this, what we would call Palm Sunday. Palm Sunday, he's ridden into Jerusalem. He's looked around. He's gone home to Bethany, and now he's come back on Monday. And so we see, picking up chapter 11, verse 12, and actually I think we can go ahead and read this. Ross, will you read chapter 11, verses 12 to, let's go 12 to 21.
Okay. On the following day, when they came from Bethany, Jesus was hungry. Seeing in the distance a fig tree in leaf, he went to see whether perhaps he would find anything on it. When he came to it, he found nothing but leaves, for it was not the season for figs. He said to it, "May no one ever eat fruit from you again." And his disciples heard it. Then they came to Jerusalem, and he entered the temple and began to drive out those who were selling and those who were buying in the temple. And he overturned the tables of the money changers and the seats of those who sold doves, and he would not allow anyone to carry anything through the temple. He was teaching and saying, "Is it not written, 'My house shall be called a house of prayer for all nations,' but you have made it a den of robbers." And when the chief priests and the scribes heard it, they kept looking for a way to kill him, for they were afraid of him, because the whole crowd was spellbound at his teaching. And when evening came, Jesus and his disciples went out of the city. In the morning, as he passed by, they saw the fig tree withered away to its roots. Then Peter remembered and said to him, "Rabbi, look, the fig tree that you cursed has withered." Jesus answered them, "Have faith in God. Truly, I tell you, if you say to this mountain, 'Be taken up and thrown into the sea,' and if you do not doubt in your heart, but believe that what you say will come to pass, it will be done for you. So I tell you, whatever you ask for in prayer, believe that you have received it, and it will be yours."
Great. So again, we see the Markan sandwich. The fig tree comes before and right after Jesus's what we call cleansing of the temple, what some scholars would call a symbolic destruction or cursing of the temple. Jesus comes across a fig tree, it's not bearing fruit, he curses it, he goes to the temple, he overturns the tables and declares it a place where thieves go after they've done their thieving, after they've done their robbing, they hide away in the temple. Then he leaves the temple and the next day comes across a fig tree and it's all withered up. We're meant to see the fig tree as a symbol of the temple and the actions of Jesus to curse the fig tree because it's no longer bearing fruit, and Jesus's relationship to the temple because it's no longer bearing fruit. This is the way Mark is telling this story so that we get this. Now, what's interesting is when, say, Matthew picks up this story, and I don't know, who knows? Can Matthew not tell because he's reading it rather than hearing it read that that's what Mark's doing? Or maybe he just doesn't care. But he puts the cursing and the withering all together. He breaks apart the Markan sandwich. He puts the bread on one end and puts the meat over next to it, but he doesn't put the meat within the bread. And so Jesus curses the fig tree withers, and then he's done with the fig tree. But we can see how Mark is doing this again as an oral story. I know we need to go ahead and wrap up. We've really been going a while here, but I want to lift up two final things, and then Ross, I'll invite you if you have anything else you want to say. Part of what the brilliance of Mark is that he tells you what he's doing, and he invites you to pay attention, and invites you to kind of follow along with what he's doing. And he does this in Mark chapter 4. Now, when we think about the parables of Jesus, I think it's natural for us to think, and this may have been the way that Jesus used parables, but it's certainly natural for us to assume that Jesus told parables, stories, to help people understand his teachings, like a sermon illustration. If I tell you a story, then you can kind of get a better grasp of it than if I just tell you abstract concepts. But actually, in Mark's view, the way Mark has Jesus talk about the parables, that's not the way, that's not what the purpose of the parables is at all. So Jesus tells a parable at the beginning of chapter 4, and then in 4:10, we read this. And when Jesus was alone, those who were about him with the 12, that is his kind of inner circle, his disciples, asked him concerning the parables. And he said to them, "To you has been given the secret of the kingdom of God. But for those outside, everything is in parables, so that they may indeed see, but not perceive, and may indeed hear, but not understand, lest they should turn again and be forgiven." So in other words, in Mark's gospel, the purpose of parables isn't to help elucidate teaching. It's to make it more obscure so people don't understand what Jesus is saying. Now, I think the reason why this is included in Mark's text, and this is again speculation, it all has to do with interpretation. But I think because Mark is telling us, in some sense, this whole thing is a parable. One thing you'll notice about Mark, as opposed to, say, Matthew and Luke, is Jesus doesn't actually tell a whole lot of parables in Mark. The parables come in Matthew's gospel and in Luke's gospel, especially Luke's gospel. Jesus only tells a couple of parables in Mark's gospel because the whole thing is a parable. And he's telling us, that if you're paying attention, if you're part of, in a sense, if you're a disciple of Jesus, this text is going to be telling you things, the secrets of the kingdom of God. But you've got to listen carefully. You've got to pay attention. And so we see this. Gosh, there's so much we could talk about in this, about, for example, the parable from verses 1 to 9 in chapter 4 about the different seed falling on the different ground. But I'm going to leave some of that aside because we're running short on time. Maybe we can talk about it on Wednesday. But if you look at the overall structure of Mark's gospel, like I said, at the very beginning, we get this. He begins, after saying the beginning of the gospel of Jesus Christ, or Jesus the Messiah, the Son of God, He then goes into the baptism of Jesus. He introduces John the Baptist, and then we get the baptism of Jesus. And at the baptism of Jesus, so let me turn to that really quick. Jesus goes down into the water, and here in verse 10, and when he came up, this is chapter 1, verse 10, when Jesus came up out of the water, immediately he saw the heavens opened and the Spirit descending upon him like a dove. And this is important because in other Gospels, other people are going to see this, but Mark focuses on who sees it? Jesus sees the heavens open and the Spirit descending upon him like a dove. And a voice came from heaven, "Thou art my beloved Son, with thee I am well pleased." We get the divine voice, the Bauckham, the Vox Dei, declaring Jesus the Son of God. Now, no one else is going to call him that, except demons will say that they know who he is, and Jesus will tell them to be quiet. We don't get anyone else saying anything like that until chapter 8, which is just midway through the gospel. And then we have Jesus right outside of Caesarea Philippi. Let's see, is that where it is? Sorry, I should have looked up verses before I did this. Well, let me pick up with this on in chapter 8. Well, I'll leave this. There's something about a blind man that would help us see better. But anyway,
So verse 22. Can you see anything? I see like trees walking.
Right. I was gonna mention the blind man because he becomes for us a symbol of the disciple who is just, the disciples are just beginning to see who Jesus is midway through the story. So we see this blind man whom Jesus heals, and he kind of misses the mark at first, and the blind man only sees people moving about as if like trees, and Jesus has to do kind of an add-on healing for him to see more clearly. It's not as if Jesus failed at the healing, but Mark is again telling us a story that the disciples are just now midway through the story beginning to see who Jesus really is. Ross, do you know off the top of your head Jesus is where Peter? Oh, here we go. It's verse 27. So it's right after this blind man begins to see partly, but he can't yet see fully. We get the story of Jesus and the disciples at Caesarea Philippi. This is verse 27. And Jesus says, "Who do you say that I am?" And they told him John the Baptist, and others say Elijah, and others one of the prophets. And he asked them, "But who do you say that I am?" And Peter answered him, "You are the Christ," that is the Messiah. And he charged them to tell no one about it. So they're beginning to get who Jesus is. They're beginning. Peter recognizes Jesus as the Messiah. That's the first time a disciple has called him that in Mark's gospel. But he doesn't recognize what that means, namely that Messiah means that Jesus is Son of God and that he will have to suffer and die. Because Jesus then goes on to explain that he's going to have to die. He's going to go, and Jesus began to teach them that the Son of Man must suffer many things and be rejected by the elders and the chief priests and the scribes and be killed, and after 3 days rise again. And he said this plainly. And Peter took him and began to rebuke him by turning and seeing his disciples, he rebuked Peter and said, "Get behind me, Satan, for you are not on the side of God, but of men." So Peter still doesn't see clearly who Jesus is. This is a turning point in the gospel, and it's right midway between the beginning and the end. And we get Peter's starting to understand, but Jesus has to rebuke him the way he's been rebuking the unclean spirits. And because he doesn't quite understand what this means, that Messiah is Son of God. And then we get the transfiguration story in chapter 9, and we don't need to go into all of that. But again, the voice from heaven, the voice of God says, "This is my beloved Son, listen to him." So now we've had two times that God has proclaimed Jesus his son, that the Father has proclaimed Jesus to be his son. And we should be anticipating now, if we're hearing this read all at once, at one time, that there will be one more time that we'll hear this at the very end of the story. Well, they go to Jerusalem from there. We get the Passion narrative. And we do hear Jesus proclaim Son of God one last time, but it's not by God. It's by one of the people putting him to death. It's by a Roman centurion. It says, "Surely this is a Son of God," when Jesus breathed his last. And so we are kind of, as we're going along in the story, we should be shocked that the disciples never seem to get it. And that's a theme in Mark's gospel. But the outsiders do. That where we would expect God to say, "This is my son," we get a centurion, a Roman centurion, saying, "Surely this was God's son." Where we expect his female disciples to get it, to believe, they don't believe, right? That's why they go to the tomb after his death to anoint his body, because they don't think he's going to rise in 3 days. If they thought he was going to rise in 3 days, they wouldn't worry about going to his tomb to anoint his body. But they don't believe it. Rather, an unnamed woman in Bethany who washes Jesus's feet and annoys the disciples gets it, because she realizes she has to do the anointing before he's crucified, because he will rise afterwards and there won't be any need to do the anointing after he's crucified. So we get this interesting thing where the insiders are made to be outsiders, the outsiders are called to be insiders. And this is where I'm going to have to end. There's so much more. I love this gospel, if you haven't noticed. There's so much more I could say about it, but here's where I'm going to end, which is that you'll notice in your Bible that after verse 8 of chapter 16, you'll see sometimes in some Bibles a break before you get any further verses. And that's because any verses after 16:8 are a later addition to the gospel text itself. The earliest, the autograph copy seems to have ended at 16:8. And again, that's where we get the women coming to the tomb, and they go to the tomb. Jesus isn't there, but a young man in a white robe is there, and the young man says, tells them, do not be amazed. You seek Jesus of Nazareth, who is crucified. He has risen. He is not here. See the place where they laid him, but go. Tell his disciples and Peter that he is going before you to Galilee. There you will see him as he told you. And so they're given a mission. Go proclaim the resurrection of Jesus. And what do? Well, in this gospel, verse 8, the very last verse, "And they went out and fled from the tomb, for trembling and astonishment had come upon them, and they said nothing to anyone, for they were afraid." They don't do what they're supposed to do. They don't proclaim the resurrection of Jesus. Now, there's a couple things to mention here, and I'm going to do this really quick, and then I think we really need to wrap it up. But the things that I want to lift up here is that the disciples fail, the male disciples and the female disciples, they all fail. But you, as the reader or the hearer, are invited to be like the centurion, the unexpected outsiders who've now been brought into the secret of the kingdom so that you can proclaim it. And that's the way that this ends. There's a suggestion that this was read, and Ross, I think you were alluding to this, that this text may have been read at baptisms. And one of the reasons why folks think that, scholars think that, is this young man in a white robe who's not identified as an angel in this gospel, who's sitting in the tomb of Jesus and tells him to go and proclaim his resurrection. This young man we see earlier in the text when Jesus is arrested. And it's a weird text in Mark's gospel, and you can look it up, but Jesus is arrested, and the folks who've come to arrest him, the temple guard, the Roman soldiers, they reach out and they grab at a disciple, an unnamed disciple who's wearing a white robe, and they get a hold of the robe, but they don't get a hold of the disciple, and the robe comes off and the disciple runs away naked. And that scene is right there in the Garden of Gethsemane scene. Actually, Mark doesn't mention the Garden of Gethsemane scene, but the scene on the Mount of Olives after Jesus, or as Jesus is being arrested. Then this young man shows up again in a white robe in the tomb. So his story, here's another Mark sandwich. The story of this young man in a white robe is the sandwich, and the meat, it's the bread of the sandwich, and the meat of the sandwich is Jesus's crucifixion and burial. So the suggestion is, just as we hear in Romans 6, that in our baptism, we die with Christ. This young man is a symbol of the new believer who has been baptized into the death of Christ. That's why he wears the white robe, which was a symbol of baptism, but baptisms in the early church were done in the nude, so that's why he runs off naked. But we see him again in his nice new baptismal gown, sitting in the empty tomb of Jesus. And so it's thought that this imagery means that the gospel according to Mark was read right before catechumens were baptized, where in the early church they would actually go fully immersed into the water. And so they would walk down into the baptismal font, into the water, be immersed, and then come back up as if they had been buried with Christ, died with Christ, and been buried with Christ. They would do that in the nude. They would be dressed in a white gown. And so there's a belief that this whole gospel, which is nice and succinct, was read right before going into the waters of baptism. Now, if that's the case, then this messianic secret, as some scholars have called it throughout here, is teaching us that you're not going to know who Christ truly is and his deeds of power and his healings and his, not even in his teachings, because the parables are meant to obscure, not to clarify. You're not going to know what it really means for Christ to be the Messiah until you see him on the cross, dying for your sins, and you join him in that in baptism. And if you have done that, if you have recognized that he truly is, as the centurion says, the Son of God, because you've seen him on the cross, dying for you, then you're left as the newly baptized with this question: are you going to be like those disciples who failed him and just run away terrified, not saying anything to anyone? Or will you boldly proclaim the resurrection of the Lord that you have just participated in through your baptism? I know that's a lot, but I felt like I had to get all that in there. Ross, did you have anything that you wanted to say?
Oh, this has been a great discussion, Nick. And as you've talked tonight, it's helped me understand why I love Mark so much. This quality, the oral quality, it leaves some questions unanswered. There's some mysteries. There's some sort of gaps in Mark that perhaps are not quite this. The literary quality of Matthew and Luke means that they tie things up a bit more logically, whereas Mark leaves some things open-ended and sort of mysterious, but it's in that mystery that often the new insights come. So you've helped me appreciate why I love Mark so much.
Great. And same here. So, and we hope that we together have helped you all appreciate Mark. And we suggest that you give it a read when you have a chance. It's the shortest of the Gospels. It would be great to just sit down and read through it from beginning to end in one sitting, or see if you can find a video of the gentleman that Ross mentioned, or someone else performing the gospel according to Mark all the way through. What was his name again, Ross?
Alec McGowan.
That's right. Yeah.
And yeah, there are a number of different recordings of the Bible, the entire Bible, New Testament, that you can get for free on YouTube and various places. So yeah, just be able to listen to Mark's gospel at some point would be a gift, I think, to you.
Yeah, and I really think that it's listening to it from beginning to end that really helps to reveal some of this larger structure and these techniques that he uses, and just the beauty of that gospel. Well, I think we've taken up enough of everybody's time. But Ross, I appreciate, as always, you joining me for these discussions.
Thank you, Nick. It's a real privilege for me as well.
Oh, thank you. And we will see you all Wednesday, and we'll have another of these videos out next week. Take care.
Look forward to it.